Good afternoon. Want to thank all the members of the media who have made time to be here today. I want to thank my friend and colleague from Nassau County, the new county executive, Bruce Blakeman, for being here today. You know, it's good to get local leaders. I was a mayor, not a county executive, but it's great to get local leaders up here to Albany to talk about issues that are, I think sometimes when we talk about issues here in the Capitol, my colleague, Leader Will Barclay, obviously is joining us today. Our colleagues from the Assembly Republican Conference are here today. But I think a lot of times when we have these press conferences and we talk about issues, we talk about them, it's like it's happening in this building, right? It's happening in Albany, and we forget that these issues have real impacts back home. They have real impacts for our county executives, for our town supervisors, for our men and women in law enforcement, for our teachers, healthcare workers. That's where the impact really is. And I think sometimes it's important to have local officials come up here to speak to those issues. So you're not just hearing from us, you're not just hearing from myself and Leader Barclay, but you're hearing from a county executive who was just elected by his constituents to represent and lead his county for the next 4 years. Last week, we unveiled, my colleagues in the Senate Republican Conference unveiled our Take Back New York agenda. And we're calling, and we believe we offer an alternative. And I said this then, and I'll say it again. It's important that the people of New York State, from Nassau County to Niagara County, and everywhere in between, know that there's an alternative to the governing philosophy and policies and EOs and mandates that have come out of Albany the last 2 years, the last 3 years. We offer that alternative. And it was 3 prongs. It called for a safer, stronger, and healthier New York. Today, we're going to talk about that first prong, safer. Because without that one, everything else hinges on a safer state. And what we've seen in the past 3 years under Democrat rule here in New York State is a less safe New York. The statistics do not lie. Crime is up. Violent crime is up. Assaults, murders, robberies are up. People dying of drug addiction are up. And what are we doing about it? What have the Democrats done about it? They have leaned in and continued to push policies that focus on criminals, that would have you believe that every criminal is really a victim. They're a victim of the system. This conference believes that criminals are criminals and the victims are the ones we never seem to talk about, or the majority never seems to talk about. And we know that bail reform and the cashless bail has created more victims. If I had a nickel for every time I heard one of my colleagues with any bill they pass, they say, if it only saves one life, it's worth it. And maybe that's true. Maybe that is a true statement. But if that's true, then any law that created even one more victim would be a bad law if you follow that philosophy to its end. And this law, cashless bail, has created more victims, period. It also has put the men and women who wear the uniform in law enforcement, it has put them in even greater harm's way. It's already a hard job. It's already a high-risk job. We already ask them to do heroic things. And this law and others that have been put forward here in Albany make their job harder. And quite frankly, there are laws out there that have demonized law enforcement, that make them out to be the perpetrator and the criminal to be the victim. This conference and the Assembly Republican Conference and County Executive Blakeman do not believe that. And we are putting forward an alternative agenda that supports our men and women in law enforcement, that puts the onus and the focus where it belongs, on victims, not on those who are victimized. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Again, I want to thank my colleague in the Assembly, who you're going to hear from now. He's a friend. He is someone who has stood shoulder to shoulder with our conference, with his members on this issue and a host of other issues. And I would like to welcome to the podium now my colleague and friend, leader of the Republican Conference in the Assembly, Will Barclay.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Leader Ortt, for your leadership and your conference's leadership and partnership on this issue. I want to thank my conference for being here. As Republicans, we've tried to be on the forefront of this issue because it's very important, obviously. And I want to thank the county executive and wish him congratulations and thank you for coming up, and all the law enforcement that are here to join us on this very important issue. Obviously, we're here to talk about public safety. And, I gave an interview, a radio interview this morning, and I said, this really isn't a partisan issue. I think if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, we all want safe streets, don't we? It doesn't make a difference what political party you're from. And, there's a direct line. There's a direct line through some of these policies that have been brought by the majorities in these houses, whether it's bail reform, whether it's raise the age, or whether it's just or how about defund the police, or whether it's just this anti-police narrative. There's a direct line that can be drawn between them and the increase that we've seen in crime in New York State. And I've done this at other press conferences, and I want to do it now. I just want to read some of the statistics because I think sometimes on the other side, they try to say these aren't having any effect on crime. I just want to prove that it is and show you some of these statistics. Albany, right here in Albany, the number of people killed by gun violence has increased 700% since 2019. You think it's just limited to Albany? Rochester, number of people killed is up 179% in the past 2 years. Syracuse, up 91%. And Buffalo, gun deaths are up 70%. New York City, number of shooting victims has risen by 101% over the last 2 years. So you can see crime is up, violent crimes up throughout the state. I think we all saw that great article in the Times-Union, I think it was last week, where they did a deep dive. They did a couple years ago on Raise the Age and the impacts of Raise the Age. They did a deep dive on bail reform. According to their statistics, 3,500 cases of people have been rearrested that have been released on felony accounts that have been released because of bail reform. Just recently, New York City released a report on their supervised release program. Granted, this is not a state program, but it's based on similar to the bail reform that we see in this state. 28% of those individuals who were freed were rearrested on felony charges. If you put misdemeanors, it increases to 50%. So it's amazing. You see what's going on. You see this increase in crime. And as Leader Ortt said, instead of looking back and trying to come up with policies that are going to change this trajectory we're on, they're doubling down. They're doubling down. You got people like the DA in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, who's pushing progressive changes to criminal justice reform, who says that we should downgrade crimes like robbery. You almost have to read it. You just can't believe it. Someone told me this 5 years ago. I said that would never happen. And here you have it, publicly doing that. It's incredible. And the liberals, they're all for this prosecutorial leeway, discretion. But God, if you give the judges any discretion to keep our communities safe, they're completely against it. If that doesn't show that they're wrong-headed on this, I don't know what else does. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to County Executive Blakeman to give his experiences.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Leader Ortt and Leader Barclay for their kind invitation to come up here today and stand with these courageous members of the Senate and the Assembly who are fighting every day in their district for the people in their district and for the people of the state of New York. So it's a true honor for me to be here today. I want to also say that I'm here today with people who are on the front lines of this battle. I'm here today with our great commissioner of the Nassau County Police Department, Patrick Ryder. We have the 14th largest police department in the United States, and also our Undersheriff Anthony LaRocca, and all of our police unions are here today. And our law enforcement unions are here today because we are together. We know this is a public safety issue. And I would say this to the governor. It's very instructive, Governor, that you have threatened school board members with their removal for not following your mask mandate, but you have not threatened the district attorney of Manhattan, who fails to prosecute people under the law. It's an inconsistency. So we're all here today for the reason of protecting our communities. And when you look at this bail reform law, it's nothing more than a get-out-of-jail-free card. And let's look at some of the statistics. I was with our commissioner yesterday. Pat, how many guns did you take off the street in the last few weeks?
117 in the last year and over 20 in the last 2 weeks.
And how many of those guns that you seized were from people who were out because bail could not be set for them?
38%.
38%. Let me give you an example. The defendant, Gregory, I'm going to use his first name, arrested August 31, 2020, no bail. December 12, 2020, no bail. December 2nd, 2021, no bail. He was found with an illegal firearm. How about defendant Daniel, arrested April 6, 2020, of criminal possession of a firearm, no bail. Arrested July 11, 2020, no bail. So these are just a couple of the examples of why we are all here today. It's madness, it's crazy, and enough is enough. And we are urging the colleagues of the assemblymen and assemblywomen who are here today and the senators that are here today who are on the Democratic side of the aisle, join with us. Admit that you made a mistake, and let's end bail reform right now, because it's not bail reform. It's taking away from the judiciary the right to decide whether somebody is a flight risk or a danger to the community, and that's a violation of the separation of powers. I know we have a governor that likes to lecture me on the law, but I believe that that is a violation of the separation of powers. It solely belongs within the province of the judiciary. Let's get back to it. Enough is enough. Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues here in a second, but I did want to recognize, as the county executive pointed out, so we have the Nassau Police Benevolent Association is here, Tom Shevlin. The Suffolk PBA is represented here today. We have Rick Frassetti from the Nassau Superior Association. We have John Wighouse from the Nassau Detectives Association, Brian Sullivan from Nassau Corrections. We have Manny Villar from the Police Conference in New York, Patrick Ryder, as you heard from the Nassau County Police Commissioner, and Anthony LaRocca from the Nassau County Undersheriff. I do want to assure everyone there are still plenty of men and women who are protecting Nassau County as we speak, but that's important. But at this time, I want to call up someone who knows about this issue in a way that the rest of us don't, or certainly most of us don't. We all speak on this issue as public officials who take public safety very seriously. My colleague, Senator White, lives this. Apart from being a state senator, she is the wife of a member of law enforcement, and she is the mother of a member of law enforcement. So no one lives this day in and day out and has a better perspective, in my opinion, than her. So Senator White.
Thank you so much, Leader Ortt and Leader Barclay, for having this press conference today, because our voices can't be heard frequently enough on this topic. As the wife, as it was stated, as the wife and the mother of law enforcement officers, I know firsthand the challenges and dangers they face on a day-to-day basis. And I'm proud to stand here today with my hometown police department, the Suffolk PBA, and Nassau County. And all the rest of law enforcement who is here today standing with us. The policies coming out of Albany have left our communities less safe, struggling with fear and a dangerous spike in crime. It's time for us to make meaningful changes to our bail reform laws. We cannot continue to let violent criminals perpetuate a catch-and-release policy where these criminals have the opportunity to recommit crimes. Murders are up, gun violence is up, hate crimes are up, and about every bad outcome that we predicted has happened. Bail reform was, I guess, intended to make criminal justice system more efficient and more fair, but there's nothing more efficient or fair for the criminals of these heinous crimes. Bail reform has created a sharp increase in the number of victims from crimes, and as criminals are quickly released, we see a sharp decrease in the protection for those victims. Another troubling outcome is that when we talk to the families of the individuals who've committed these crimes, they'll tell you catch and release does more harm than good. The holding process has often acted as an essential time barrier needed to evaluate and help the individual who's committed the crime. And it's not just an act of locking someone up. And the police department is trained and they know how to look at an individual and get that individual the help they may need. So what we need to do here is clear. We need to end the revolving door for violent criminals. We need to end cashless bail and restore the judicial discretion. And we need to center our policies around the victims and around those who sworn to protect us, our law enforcement. It's time. We need to restore common sense and public safety to New York right now. Thank you.
Paul Riley, and then I'll follow.
Okay, okay. So we're blessed in our conference to have a very diverse people from different backgrounds, and obviously those who are involved in law enforcement know the most about this specific topic. And I'm happy to introduce Assemblymember Riley from Staten Island, who's a former NYPD policeman. So, Assemblyman.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you. As someone who actually wore the shield, put on the vest every day, and protected the city of New York and our residents, I'm appalled. I'm appalled by what I'm seeing and what I'm dealing with here in Albany and in my lovely city of New York, where I grew up, where I call home. You know, we talk about bail reform, we talk about making sure that we hold those accountable. But the problem is, it falls on deaf ears. It's time for New Yorkers to wake up. You've been fed a bunch of lies. You've been told that everybody needs to be given multiple chances. The funny thing is, you're not given multiple chances if you're the victim. And that's the sad reality. We talked about some numbers before. Leader Barclay mentioned them. You know what's ironic? The state had to take off the data off their website because they lied to you. They lied to you about bail reform. And then, within hours, they put up new numbers. And those new numbers said, if you factor in misdemeanors and felonies, 50% of those released on bail due to this new law commit another crime. That's another family member of yours that's a victim. That's your neighbor. That's your senior citizen relative down the street. And now we have a Manhattan DA that's doubling down. You know, he mentioned in an interview, and I looked at it, and I looked at his memo. Day one. Day one. That's what it's entitled. It should be 0, because that's the safety he's providing to the citizens of New York. You know, we may think that only Manhattan deals with that, but if you're a business owner from outside the city or from one of the other boroughs and you get robbed, you're going to charge him with petty larceny. Now, he said the police commissioner of New York City misread his day one memo. Well, I got news for you. I read it, and I didn't misread it. Mr. Bragg, you are doing a disservice to the city of New York and the residents of Manhattan. Because let me tell you, if you commit a crime like robbery, the threat of fear and injury is always at play, whether you have a firearm or whether you have a dangerous instrument. That dangerous instrument could be a hanger, could be a nail file. But what's ironic is, in that memo, he says that the assistant district attorney holding the case has to determine whether that person was in fear. Put yourself in that victim's shoes. If you think someone is going to hurt you as they remove your property, and then the insult to injury, you have a district attorney who's going to say, well, basically it's like stealing a pack of lifesavers. But meanwhile, your life was put in jeopardy. That's the policies that are coming out of this chamber with the majority and out of our colleagues in the Senate. Wake up, New York, or else you're not going to have a New York. Thank you.
That's how you really feel.
Well, that'll be a tough act to follow for Senator Gallivan. But while different in demeanor, Senator Gallivan, a colleague of mine from Western New York, also, like Assemblyman Riley, wore the uniform, wore a shield, not only as a state trooper, but as the sheriff of Erie County for several years. And he knows this issue well. He has been a great articular defender of public safety. He opposed, obviously, the cashless bail. I know spoke on the floor many times, and I'd like to call him. He was at a health committee hearing. He has stepped away from that important meeting to speak here at this very important press conference. So, Senator Gallivan, if you come up.
Good afternoon. How often have we heard our executives, the past one and the current one, say that government's most fundamental and most important responsibility is to protect the public? New York is failing. We know the numbers. I'll repeat a few of them. We see the reoffense rate going on. You look at some numbers out of New York City, 50% of the people that are out on bail are rearrested for something. We see the district attorneys across the state dismissing hundreds, collectively thousands of cases because of the changes in the discovery laws. We see victims across the state, witnesses rather, afraid to come forward for fear for their own safety and their family's safety. These are the policies we've seen the last 2 years with one-party rule in Albany, clearly policies that we know now, we said then, but we know now, first, don't work, and clearly favor offenders over law-abiding citizens. The Assemblyman spoke of the victims. We often lose sight of the victims when we talk numbers. We hear the other side talk about making sure that people are treated fairly, which they should be, constitutionally, which they should be, but it should be on balance. And then we hear statistics about rearrests, and we talk about offenders. You hear very little except out of the people standing here and our own colleagues in our respective conferences about victims. But the victims are our families. They're the members of people in our community. I would venture to say that we've got a good percentage of people standing here, both legislators and law enforcement officers and other elected officials, whose family members have been their own victims, or somebody that they know. Their relatives, their neighbors. Some little child's bicycle is stolen. Well, let's just pass that off as a nonviolent offense. Who cares? The repeated larcenies from Duane Reade. Well, who cares? The repeated larcenies from the deli. Well, who cares? We care. They're taking people's property. They're robbing them of a good quality of life that we should be enjoying in New York State, and it is clearly wrong. Every time somebody offends, there is a matching victim. And the so-called victimless crimes have victims. All of us, the people of the state of New York, we should be doing something about it. We've been trying the last couple of years, standing up. We go back to these policies when we said they favored offenders over law-abiding citizens, And I'm sorry to say, we told you then, we're telling you now, we told you so. So what if we're right? We have to do something about it and reverse this course. We can do things about it. We can change the discovery laws. We can focus on the people that are in prison or that are being held, whether it's with bail or held for some other reason, and make adjustments so their cases are heard on a timely basis. We have to do something about bail. We're one of only less than a handful of states in the United States that does not consider public safety, does not consider dangerousness when an offender is arrested and brought before a judge and released on bail or not. That is the simple answer, is changing these laws. And it starts with bail, and we need to insert dangerousness of the individual along with this. It's a misnomer to say that dangerousness was never considered before. It was. Anytime a defendant that was held on bail or his attorney questioned whether or not bail should be set or the dollar amount, dangerousness of the individual was permitted to be discussed, and it was. It is government's job. Number one, remember these executives, Cuomo, Hochul, and I think all of my colleagues agree, have said that it is our most basic responsibility to keep our people safe. New York is failing. We can fix it. We change the bail laws. Often they point to New Jersey and they say, hey, they have cashless bail over there and it's working. It's working for a whole bunch of reasons. Because they properly supervise people that are held, and more importantly, because they give judges the discretion to consider dangerousness, and they do it using a risk assessment instrument that is verified as being legitimate and valid, and something like that has worked across the country in all of these states and all of these places where our opponents want to hold up and say, hey, they got rid of cash bail. Well, there's a yeah, but. They're not doing it the way that New York is with the free pass and the relaxation of parole policies and the relaxation or the tightening down of discovery policies to affect all these prosecutions. We can change it. We have to start now, or we'll have more and more victims. And if your family has not been victimized, it will be if we continue in this direction. So I'm very proud to stand with my colleagues. I'm very proud to stand with the other elected officials here today, and very proud to stand with law enforcement, who I know that all the people standing with me in our respective conferences support. This past week, we celebrated National Law Enforcement Day. My view, we should be doing that each and every day and thanking our law enforcement officials for standing up. For standing up despite the hurdles that New York State puts in their way. My colleagues will continue to stand up, and we call on our colleagues across the aisle to do the same, and our new governor to do the same for the sake of all New Yorkers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and particularly thank you for talking about the victims. I think often in this conversation, we don't raise that issue enough. The next speaker we have is from the Assembly, and we've been privileged here to hear from a lot of law enforcement, but the next speaker was a former assistant district attorney in New York City. I'd like to ask to come to the podium Assembly Member Mike Tannousis.
Thank you so much. I'm just happy I'm not following Mike Riley. So in order to express to you how I feel about this issue and how strong I feel that changes need to be made, I have to explain to you how I got to the position where I'm at. I was a career prosecutor. I spent time in the Bronx District Attorney's Office and the Richmond County District Attorney's Office, and I rose through the ranks. Misdemeanors, felonies, violent felonies, murder cases. My last year, I prosecuted 2 murder cases. One of those cases was a guy that murdered his girlfriend and her babies. And as I was trying that case, one night, about 9 o'clock at night, I was in the office. I was prepping witnesses for the next day. And all of a sudden, I see a news flash come through on my computer. New York State Assembly considers passing cash bail. I knew at that point that being a prosecutor or being a police officer was never going to be the same. And I decided to do something about it, and that's why I'm here. We knew these laws weren't going to work. At the same time, I will tell you, I'll be the first to tell you, the criminal justice system is not perfect. Nobody is claiming that it is. But the only people these laws help are career criminals. How many victims are going to have to walk through the doors of a courthouse to testify, or of a grand jury, or of a district attorney's office, continuously, month after month, because they are continued to be victimized by the same defendants? Enough is enough. Change needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. I call on my Democratic colleagues to make those necessary changes. No matter how they slice and dice it, crime is up. Violent crime is up. They should all take notice of how Eric Adams won the mayor's race in New York City in that crowded Democratic primary. He was pro-police. He addressed the increase, or stated that he would be addressing the increase in violent crime. Let that be an indication. Make the changes now. No more victims. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank my colleagues, those who spoke and those who are here. You can hear a lot of, there's a lot of passion, but there's a lot of my colleagues, as you heard, they have firsthand knowledge of this issue. Whether it was as a DA, whether it was as a police officer, a sheriff, a mom, a wife, a county executive. And again, Mayor Adams, there's been other mayors, Mayor Brown in Buffalo, Democrats, who have said these laws need to be addressed. The changes that were made to cashless bail need to be fixed, need to be addressed, because they aren't working on the ground. They may be working academically here to some of my colleagues, but they're not working on the ground. They're not working when it comes to our most sacred duty, which is to protect the public. And I may get this question, but I want to address something that I think the county executive brought up with regard to the increase in crime, and he was talking about the increase in gun violence and the guns that were picked up. And last week we heard the lieutenant governor, I know, and I think the governor talked about tracking illegal guns coming into the state from other states. And that's great. I don't think anyone here is going to say that's a bad thing. We want to find those illegal guns. But unless you're going to prosecute the people who use the illegal gun to commit a crime, what's the point? Because they're going to continue to find another illegal gun to commit the crime later, or some other kind of weapon. We're tougher on people who have legally owned guns than we are people who possess illegal guns. That's a fact. That is a fact here in New York. So again, this is well within our ability to do something about it. We broke it. We need to fix it. And I, again, want to thank my colleagues for being here. At this point, I'm going to ask, so we'll do on-topic questions related to bail, criminal justice first, and then we can do off-topic. I would just ask members of the media, because there's multiple members here, including different levels of government, if you have a question, if you could just identify who your question is directed to, if it's directed to the county executive, myself, Leader Barclay, or whomever.
Well, mine's kind of for everybody. It's about the bail reform and the arrest numbers. Seems like there's been some discrepancy. I know when the Times Union reported the numbers, the Office of Court Administration apparently shut the website down and now we're revising them. I'm just wondering if you guys, what you make of that. You think it's a simple mistake?
Karen, I appreciate the question. In all seriousness, I think we all kind of chuckle, because this isn't the first issue with numbers and reporting that New York State has had just in the past 12 months, especially when it comes to deaths and victims. whether it's the nursing home data, which I will leave for another day, and we've talked about it a lot. But now we have yet another, and then people wonder why don't people trust government agencies? This is something you have to get right. And there's probably a kid sitting in college that could have got it right, and somehow we couldn't get it right. Something this important. By the way, a letter that Leader Barclay and I sent to the Office of Court Administration over this months ago, never heard an answer. So they've been working on this, I suspect, for a long time. So just the fact that they went down and they had to put up revised numbers, I think really brings in a lot of doubt, a lot of suspicion related to this. And as you heard from Assemblyman Riley, the truth is the new numbers, when you take into everything, are worse.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit, I mean, putting aside the statistics, I mean, that's important to prove our point. But I think you talk to anybody, it's common sense. It's common sense. You don't let dangerous criminals back out in the street. I don't need 100 statistics to prove to me that's a bad policy. So we'll see what they do, but I'm not optimistic we're going to get the straight story.
Just for the county executive, Sacramento City and State, this rally is all about law and order politics. How do you reconcile your appearance here with your recent executive orders encouraging local officials to disobey state?
Well, the United States Supreme Court is considering right now whether or not mandates are constitutional. My opinion is that well, it's a mandate, so it's applicable, I believe, to what we're doing in Nassau County. So the question is, when you make a mandate that infringes upon people's constitutional rights, you have to have a compelling reason. And we have a governor who hasn't told us what the metric was to start people to wearing masks, and she still hasn't told us what the metric is to say we don't have to wear masks again. So let's see the data, and basically I'm very comfortable in my position. I'm representing the people in Nassau County, okay? And I'm talking about choice, which is what we should be talking about. What I'm saying in my county, I want to give school boards the choice. I want to give businesses the choice as to whether or not to require to wear masks. And again, the governor is very selective in what she thinks should be enforced and what state law is and what it should be prosecuted, etc. She threatened to remove school board members. She threatened to remove funding from our schools in Nassau County. But she hasn't threatened the Manhattan District Attorney, who refuses to prosecute criminals under the law. It's inconsistent.
Senator, I'm just curious, what are you proposing exactly here? A return to the previous bail system, or what we heard from law enforcement earlier, or last year, I should say, where you completely eliminate cash bail and replace it with a dangerousness-only remanding standard?
So, Darrell, I've said this to others. So I'm a big believer in never negotiating with myself, right? So obviously, I would favor a complete repeal of cashless bail. Let's get back to where we were, and then if we want to have a real dialogue, you know who wasn't included in that dialogue, and you all know this because you covered it. I know you did. The people who are standing up here, members of law enforcement, were never a part of the discussion about how can we make the system better, how can we make the system fairer. No, I can promise you, you heard from Senator Gallivan, you've heard, the men and women who wear the uniform, they want a fair system. They can tell you how to make it better. Our district attorneys, I mean, the ones who actually believe in putting people behind bars that commit crimes, I mean, they could tell you how to make it better, but they weren't. It was people like Alvin Bragg, it was advocates, and my colleagues. So meaning the decision was made before they even made the decision about which direction we're going to go. So I think we got to get back to square zero, and I think we can come up with a system that addresses financial inequities or other inequities, but takes into account dangerousness, allows judges discretion to make decisions that we elect them very often to do, which is to protect the public and to keep a dangerous person behind bars if that's needed, or protect that person from themselves.
And when it comes to the original intent, what was stated, even with Raise the Age, was about racial disparities and things of that nature. And over the past 8 months specifically, actually, there seems to have been a eureka moment where people went, they're going to have to stop committing crimes in order for this to actually happen. So they call for investment in programs like I spoke to Boys and Girls Club, and they're like, diversion for youth who may be street life involved, where there are parental deficiencies, is something that the state and cities are not investing in at an appropriate level, because your 16 to 24 is generally where the crime is happening.
Sure.
So that being said, for a safer New York, would your conference support something like investing in those programs for the youth to keep them occupied?
I'm going to say yes, and not only that, I'm going to say we have. I know when I was chair of mental health and developmental disabilities, our conference then and our conference now has always supported investments in programs or services that prevention, right? Trying to keep somebody from going down a path of criminality, trying to keep someone out of the criminal justice system. Those are, you can do two things. I think there was this notion that the only way we can properly invest in those programs is to defund the police, as if somehow taking money from those who are protecting us is somehow, that's the only way we can also invest. We have done both. Cities are doing both. Counties do both, meaning they have the obligation of, I got to make sure that the folks that protect us have the resources. But I tell you what, they don't want to be locking up 16-year-olds who should be in a mental health facility instead. They don't want to be locking up somebody who really needs a drug program instead. But that's who's called very often when there's a drug overdose. It's the police officer. It isn't the social worker. It's the police officer. When there's a domestic violence case, it isn't a social worker. Our colleagues talk about domestic violence. People elected always talk about domestic violence. We've got to protect women. Who do you think shows up when there's a domestic violence call? It's a police officer. So we need to remember that when we're having this dialogue about things we care about, mental health, prevention, domestic violence, we got to remember that at the end of the day, on the street level, it's a man or woman wearing a uniform and a badge that is very often the first person on the scene that is making the difference in those areas. And so we need to invest in both. But yes, Daryl, to your question, the answer would be yes.
And last thing,
Oh, yeah, do you want
Can I just point to one? Thanks, Rob. Just one point of that. We talked a little bit here about the victims. I think that's important, but particularly with Raise the Age, it's the people that commit the crimes, putting them back on the streets. They're almost a victim themselves. I mean, that's not answering that's not providing justice to anybody. It just causes, they run into more trouble themselves. So, it sort of irritates me sometimes, particularly when it comes to Raise the Age. We got to let, where the system's jamming these poor kids up. Well, by not giving them services or not getting them off the street, they're just as much of a victim as the people they may have committed a criminal act against.
and when it comes to the reforms that were due by April of last year from the former governor, it was sort of sold to us as a part of public safety. If there's sort of a cooperation, then that will in turn lead to lower crime rates. Has there been any measurable impact, positive or negative, on those reforms from anyone who may have a stake in that?
I haven't seen any data or any metrics made available to me, Daryl, that would lead me to believe that it is. If it's out there, again, it hasn't been made available to me. I can't speak for everyone up here. But I do think it's, as a follow-up to your other question, too, about the argument about racial disparities, I would argue that the victims of all these crimes we're talking about, they are victims of color and minorities in many, many cases. So I don't know how that's any social justice, that we're creating more victims in minority communities, in poor communities. I don't know if that's justice for them. Maybe it's justice for the people committing them, but it's injustice for the rest of us. So I would add that as well. Any other questions on bail?
Josh.
Hey, Josh.
The governor didn't mention bail reform in her State of the State, as you guys mentioned. But in her State of the State book, she did mention pretrial reform and not enough necessary implementation tools for that. Where do you and Leader Barclay stand on what the governor is currently working on in the budget of the pretrial reforms and the necessary services there? What type of reforms would you look to support?
Well, again, what I'll say is, it's sort of a follow-up or similar to what I answered earlier. Our conference has always supported investment in programs that are going to keep people out of jail. What we are not for is once someone has committed a crime to just say, well, we failed this person, we're going to just give them a pass this time. I mean, you heard from the county executive, one of those individuals, he was called with an illegal weapon, no bail, out the next day. What do we think he was going to do with that illegal weapon? So, I think that there's a difference. Yes, we can support, pretrial programs. Obviously, you know, we got to work out the price tag like we do with everything we do here in Albany, and we'll see what that price tag is and where our colleagues fall on that. But I don't think it's a this or that. I think we can do these reforms or these investing in programs and services and still make sure that people who break the law multiple times are held to account. We owe that to everybody across the state of New York.
You know, the only thing I agree with what Leader Ortt said, and I think our conference probably agrees with that too. The only thing I would mention, we don't want to take what they've done in New York City. As I went through those statistics earlier, you know, up to 50% of people are recidivist with crimes, with misdemeanors. I think it was 38% for violent felonies. So that's one system we're not going to try to copy. I hope that's not what the governor's hoping to do.
Yeah, if it's happening in New York City, we're not interested in copying it here, generally speaking. Well, real quick, I will. Is there any other on topic before we move to off topic? Okay.
So yesterday, the district lines were voted down by the Senate Assembly. What do you expect going forward? Do you think that process is going to end up in the hands of the legislature? And what do you think that's going to yield done?
What do I expect? You know, I know for a lot of people at home, this is like, you know, we're talking about bail, something very, obviously very, I think people can wrap their mind around criminal justice. This is usually a very inside baseball issue, redistricting, reapportionment, whatever you want to call it, gerrymandering. We had hoped, I'll speak for myself, I don't want to speak for Nestor, but I think I speak for most people up here. We had hoped that the Independent Redistricting Commission, that process worked and was successful in yielding a fair compromise map. Fair, I think, being the key word. But here's something I want to stress. That's not just about what Rob Ortt wanted. It turns out that's what the people of New York wanted because they voted for it. Yesterday on the floor, one of my colleagues said, well, this was drawn up by the Republicans when they were in the majority years ago. It was actually drawn up by the people of New York. It was put on the ballot for referendum. Just like the 3 initiatives that were defeated this past year, this one succeeded. This one the people did want. But clearly the will of the voters is not high on the priority list of my colleagues across the aisle. That's why they voted all the maps down. That's why they are not interested, as you could almost tell from his comments, in this process working. They want it to go to the legislature where they will have the pen. And what's frustrating about that to me is that they're disregarding the will of the voters. Voters want to select their politicians. They don't want politicians to select their voters. Obviously, my colleagues across the aisle either don't care about that. That's why they're also pushing legislation that flies in the face of the propositions that just failed less than 7 weeks ago. And so my expectation is going to go back to the IRC. I am hopeful, and if they're watching this or listening, I would call on them. Do the job that the people of New York wanted you to do. Do the job that the people of New York expect you to do, which is to create one map, a fair map that has input from both sides. I voted for the one map, the only map that had any input from both sides. The other map, Plan A, was the input of one side. Plan B was input from both sides. It was not perfect. We're not going to get a perfect map. I can promise you whatever map comes out will not be perfect. But I think a map that comes from the IRC will be better than a map that comes out of one-party gerrymandered maps. But they have it for the next 15 days. Hopefully they can come to a consensus map, and then we'll discuss and debate and see what that map comes back as.
This is obviously very nationally significant. New York has 7 Republican reps and it's one of the very blue state. Those lines were drawn by a judge. So, you know, what do you see in terms of states here? And do you see a partisan element? Do you feel that you'll get a fair shake if it goes to the legislature? Like tell me about the big one. Because you're right, this is broccoli.
Yes, yes, correct. And that's what I was trying to sort of, that was the point I did want to make, and maybe I didn't make it greatly, very well, But yes, it's broccoli, it's boring stuff to a lot of people, but the impact of this has very real implications, quite frankly, on the things we're talking about right here. And on whether we can, get changes to certain laws or stop future legislation that we feel is harmful to the state of New York. So do I feel like we'll get a fair shake? I'd like to think we would. I'm not holding my breath. I think, if it goes to the legislature, they're going to do, it's one-party control. They have supermajorities in both houses. I would expect they will draw lines that will benefit them. I don't know that. That's why I think the IRC process is important, because I think that could be a different outcome. But if it goes to the legislature, I expect we would see what you see in maybe even some other states where you have one-party control. That would be greatly disappointing to me. But again, I think the people in New York should take interest in this because you voted for a process that was supposed to be fundamentally different. You voted for a process that took away the map drawing from the legislature, and it's going to end up potentially back there. And I think the voters should know that, and I think they would be disappointed and upset. Maybe not surprised, because they've come to maybe expect these things from Albany, but they should be disappointed and upset.
Any other off-topic questions? All right, we're done.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Leader. Appreciate it.